So perhaps we can get started. Just sort of gather ourselves in. This is obviously the third in the series that we've been doing on medical astrology, Robert Phillips and myself. And this one is just going to be charts. I've got a chart that is reasonably interesting, not because the woman had terribly many health problems, but for other reasons, and I'll get to those. At the Naturopathic College, at the end of the year, we have to prepare a thesis on a subject of our own choice, which was great for me because I thought immediately medical astrology, that's something I'd really love to do. So we had to devise some reasonable way of testing it out. Now I can't claim that I did an absolutely rigid job of doing that, but what happened was that I was given the names and birth dates and birth times of three of the students from the first year class, and the first year class and the third year class had absolutely no contact. I didn't know any of the people. I weren't given their names at all, and I had to go away and write out completely sort of what sort of weak areas they'd have, what kind of things I thought that they'd have more of a tendency towards, having breakdowns in certain areas or certain disposition towards certain diseases. I then had to hand that information into the college for them to hold on to. I then went and interviewed the people that I'd done the charts for, and went through with them and took case histories, and also checked their irises to see what sort of underlying things were suggested by their irises. They were also told to go and have iris photos taken, and these iris photos were handed in with the final results, so that the naturopaths marking it could check for themselves the iris photo to make sure that there hadn't been a lot of wishful thinking on my part. Now I must admit, once I started it, I actually felt just awful. I thought, I had great faith in its psychological ramifications, because I'd worked for a long time with that, and although I'd seen very encouraging things up to that point with medical work, I really didn't think that it would carry over to the physical terribly well, and here I was putting myself right on the line, and as well I was putting astrology on the line. Now, there are several factors, of course, to take into account, one of which was in terms of medical astrology, my relative inexperience at that point. And so that has to be taken into consideration. But astrology did surprisingly well when we correlated the results.
Excuse me, do you mind moving your lectern back a bit of the blackboard for
Sure. Okay, I'll move over this way. Okay, now just to explain, iridology is actually the science of studying the iris of the eye, and iridologists claim that all of the organs of the body are actually reflex to the iris, and the kind of condition that those organs are in will be suggested by the state of the reflex position in the iris. What was really good was to have that as a thing to bounce off, or a thing to correlate what the sort of results I was getting with the chart with, because that's something that perhaps medical astrology has always lacked. Medical astrology just suggests tendencies. It doesn't say the person is going to necessarily get such and such a problem. It's only going to be if they don't treat their body correctly, or if their diet is terribly bad, or, for instance, a problem involving the Sun or Leo, which may suggest... Oh, lovely. Here's the chart of iridology, and I'll pass it round, and you'll start to see how incredibly complex it is. all of the organs, all of the parts of the body are actually reflex to it. So I'll just pass that around. If you've got problems involving the Sun or Leo, and with many difficult aspects to it, you may think to yourself that there's a possibility of back problems. But if the person has been taught from a very young age to lift in the correct way, has always sat correctly, has had a reasonable diet, then they may never manifest those problems. So here you sit down and say, well, I think you may have back problems, and the person says, no, my back's been fine. So there's an apparent, it doesn't seem to be working in that situation. The thing with iridology is that you can look at the iris and you will see lesions in certain parts of the iris, like round circular, almost like craters or holes, and you also see the relative colouring of different parts of the iris. So you can check with that person's iris and see if there's an actual lesion in the back area, suggesting an inherent weakness there anyway. So the nice thing also is to start to tie up a lot of these other fringe areas, like iridology is on the fringe of the medical world also. It's not accepted, and astrology isn't accepted either. And it's lovely when you start getting from two different disciplines like that saying exactly the same things. And that was a lovely, lovely thing, was the high correlation between iridology and what the chart was suggesting.
They're both round.
They're both round. Both round eyes. Right. Okay, so this is one of the charts that I did. So what I'd like to go through is basically, in the thesis I went through and listed all the possibilities that any of these particular combinations could have, and it was just pages and pages and pages. In fact, it must be about the most boring thesis that you could possibly read. The only worthwhile bits are the conclusion, where I tried to then step back from all that massive information and say, okay, well, what are the major points? And this is going back to what Robert was saying earlier on in the series, where you only take the things that are repeated over and over and over again. That the major points will stand out to you. Now, in terms of the chart, obviously the Sun, Moon, and Ascendant are terribly important. They will show, the constitution of the person, the flow of the health, and the condition of the physical body. So that's normally a reasonably good starting place, and then going perhaps to the 6th and 12th houses. I also tend to start with, I look at all the planets and I see, okay, which is the planet that is getting the most difficult aspects? Get it down as basic as that. That's likely to be the area where the person experiences the most stress in a physical way. And then to start to see what are the possible outcomes of that stress. Okay, so the first thing to notice is what's the relationship between the Sun and the Moon? Like the two important lights in the chart. And in this case, the Sun is in Sagittarius, quincunxing the Moon in Cancer, which is of course one of the difficult aspects, showing perhaps some seesawing on a psychological level between the expression of Cancerian energy and Sagittarian energy. Now, in terms of a physical level, I then looked further, and the Moon is receiving. I'll start off with the Moon. The Moon is, as well as the quincunx from the Sun, is also square Saturn in Libra, and it's conjunct Uranus in Cancer. Now, what kind of things, like Moon in Cancer, what kind of things do you think that suggests? If things are going to go wrong with stomach problems, right? Menstrual problems, great. Fluid retention's a good one. Anything else? Sorry? Possible difficulty with sinus, mucus, right? Good.
would diet come into it?
I would, you know,
Which is the least.
There'd be at least half a dozen indications in that chart that the diet will be the whole thing
right.
within that chart.
It's very, very important.
Well, sorry, 50% of it, because there's another one as well.
Yeah. It's very, very important, obviously. Cancer is to do with nourishment. The moon also has a role to do with nourishment.
Could be breast cancer too, couldn't it?
There may be problems with the breast in some ways, is a possibility. But the main things that I suggested from those were all the things that you suggested, you know, like diet. This person needs to be very careful here, needs to look at the kind of food combinations that they're probably having. They may be more susceptible to allergies. The moon often has a link to do with how you absorb the food that you eat, and allergies in general. And I thought perhaps the gastric secretions of the stomach may fluctuate a bit. Now, the reason for that being that you've got a square from Saturn suggesting almost a slowing down, you know, not enough secretion in a way to absorb the food that you need. And at the same time, the moon is conjunct Uranus, which is, you know, really pumping it out, but only spasmodically. You know, Uranus is only occasionally. So in stress situations, she'd probably, I thought, tend to secrete too much, you know, and perhaps have problems from that. But generally, she may be a little bit underactive and therefore not absorbing her food as well as she could. And there are other things to suggest perhaps not absorbing food quite as well as she could.
Yes, it's interesting to notice that a conjunction often shows a too much rather than a too little. It's an unusual one, that the conjunction specifically is too much. Sun conjunct Mars, too much iron, not too little. All right.
Did you in fact ask her about her eating habits?
Right. Obviously, she's a student. This has to be taken into account. She is a student. At that stage, she was a beginning student at the Naturopathic College. So obviously, diet is going to be something that she's more aware of.
But what about the manner of eating? I mean, she has digestive problems of overloading her stomach by eating too quickly.
Right. She did say that she didn't feel that she'd had any major digestive problems. She did suffer from wind, and when she was very young, if she became emotionally upset, which is the moon Uranus, then the sort of food would make her ill. You know, she couldn't digest when she was emotionally upset. There was a very strong kind of thing. Now the opposite is true. She tends to eat when she's tense or feeling low as a way of nourishing herself.
Tell me, does the moon Cancer type, I don't know if I'm looking incorrectly, does the moon Cancer type of energy say to you anything about binging?
If they're not getting the emotional needs met, yes.
Particularly with Sagittarius involved.
Overdoing.
Particularly with Sagittarius involved.
Yeah.
May I make a comment here?
Of course, Rob.
There is an interesting thing here from the other dimension, of course, other than food, that we haven't gone into. And that is to actually look at the emotional state. You know, we've mentioned this fact that we've got to look at all four. And one of the most interesting to my mind in this chart is, first of all, the Sun Sagittarius. The Sagittarius Sun, remember, is not particularly good at expressing its emotions because it doesn't want other people to be unhappy. To my mind, the Sagittarius Sun is often the most emotionally sensitive in the zodiac because it contains it all, whereas the moon in Cancer wants to express it all. But here we have this moon Uranus, so we're trying to separate from the emotions, detach from the emotions, and this is further augmented by the Saturn square, that we're really trying to control them, and of course we're going to affect the stomach. We're also affecting the nervous condition, which is and the nervous condition in the stomach.
David?
So this is under the thought of feeding problems in childhood, the attitude of the parent to the feeding.
It could well be, yeah, sure.
I mean, among other
yes, certainly.
parents, controlling factors.
Certainly.
You start to see how integrated the human is.
I started off the thesis, I thought, right, well, I'm just going to do the physical.
Yes.
And I felt totally dissatisfied. So I ended up doing physical, psychological, spiritual, and felt much happier. But it just went on to 70 pages, where it was quite as long as that. So, not just on the one chart, but on a couple. Okay, so yeah, obviously that's good. There's all the physical things as well. The psychological things that have to be taken into consideration, and I think are vital in the chart, because when I looked at it, strong emotions with the moon Cancer, but also the sun's up, all this up by the 8th house. It's going to be an important area for her.
So to what extent have you found that specific dietary needs taken by this person have resulted in changes of this personality and emotional factors?
Right, she seemed to tie them in fairly strongly. Like now when she's low, she'll binge eat, and she's considerably overweight, by the way.
But has she in fact been advised that certain things she should have and certain things she shouldn't have, and see what the chemical interaction
is
with that?
right.
Has that been taken?
She hadn't been tested for allergies. I really thought that she should, especially in terms of how dairy products, in particular, and perhaps even wheat. Because
Muscle testing.
Sorry.
And muscle testing.
Muscle testing, etc. I didn't actually do that at that stage. I was actually trying to.
An analysis.
It was more of an analysis, a case history that I was taking. But there did definitely seem to be a tie-up there. I think where it was working out more were in, things like menstruation. Her cycle was actually 110 days, which is very irregular. She did suffer from quite extreme tension, which is the moon Uranus.
Is she lonely?
Relationships aren't satisfactory. Okay, so that comes into
You can
it.
see the loneliness in that chart.
Okay. Well, some of that's the moon Saturn. Like keeping in the emotions, feelings and things.
And look at the needs for partnership. Look at the sun sitting in the 7th. Sorry about that.
Sorry. Yes.
I think we're missing a core point there. If you're focusing on the moon in Cancer, then I would immediately look at the 4th house. And look at it, Pluto right now in the cusp.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
If that's mother, and it's usually slightly more likely to be mother, then you've got a lot of mother's focus attitudes. The Pluto there rules mother's 4th house.
Yes.
There's mother's maternal attitudes.
Mm.
Mother's ways of nurturing, Plutonic. They're usually rather intense and rather rejecting.
Right.
So there's usually a lot of pain in being nurtured by a parent like that.
Mm.
So either you take the nurturing and the pain, or you try and reject the nurturing, and of course then you've got to try and reject the pain, and you're rejecting the nurturing at the same time.
Right.
It's terrible. It's a terrible bind to be in.
Right.
Personally, really, Cancer.
Right. Yes, absolutely. The especially like the Pluto's really tight conjunction to that IC point.
Another thing that I found with the 4th house is that it's also the dining table.
Sure.
It's situated at the dining table.
Again, it's got that link in with Cancer, with nourishment again. So that's good. Yes.
I know you mentioned the ascendant is Taurus, and you were mentioning that Venus rules Taurus with the sugar, love the sugar. You talk about the dining room table, the stomach. Surely that must be tied in with it as well.
Yeah, that's right. Sure. I think what's happening at this point is that what I tried to do was actually just look at one thing at a time, and in fact everybody's seeing all the other things that are there, and there's lots there.
Which incidentally is marvellous, because it shows that people are starting to absorb
and use it.
Some of the things that have been coming out through the conference.
Right. And that as you were saying, that Pluto is actually square the ascendant. So again, that ties it in very, very personally. Sorry, was there another?
As far as the mother is concerned, again, sometimes it's represented by the 10th house very often in these days. And Aquarius is up there, ruled by Uranus, which is conjunct the moon. That could be, very
very much an indicator
Yes.
of problem.
Right.
And also the expectation of the self on the due to the 10th squaring the sun.
Oh, also.
High ideals.
Aquarius
Okay.
is also co-ruled by Saturn.
Expectations.
Right. Good. Perhaps we should just. I'll sit down and you can do the chart. You're doing great. I mean, this is really good.
That there is tremendous need and expectation, and then followed by shattering disappointment.
Absolutely. There's strong mothering needs shown in the chart, but also strong needs for freedom, strong denial things happening at the same time. And, you know, it was shown very strongly in terms of she was, you know, quite overweight.
Yeah. Incidentally, was there a separation from the father in this?
I can't remember specifically on that. I tended to be taking a case mainly on the physical. Okay, so...
Do you think that simply by changing the diet very specifically and following that these factors would be mitigated?
Yes,
My suggestions were, I think she's got to do both. You know, she's actually now got to the stage where, because of the demands of her emotions and not meeting her emotional needs, that, you know, I'm sure that it's affecting her stomach secretions and the way that she's absorbing her food. So I would suggest dietary things, but also definitely emotional, psychological.
But would they alter? Would the emotional alter as a consequence of the dietary?
Yes, because you get more positivity. What I have found in my own work is that as you start, for some people you can't get through at the psychological, the emotional level to start with. They want somebody to actually instruct them, say, do this, do that, do something else. Now what happens is that their actual physical health begins to improve. And suddenly they reach that sort of snap point where they suddenly say, well, what else should I be doing? Or else they peak, they reach a level or a plateau. And at that point you can turn around and say, now then, what we have to begin to deal with are these other factors. And you can work both ways.
Yeah.
That's the point at which they start taking responsibility for
Exactly.
their own personal growth.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But sometimes they get so bogged down, like the physical is the last manifestation of things going wrong, isn't it? And they
Yes,
get so bogged down in that
yes,
they can't deal with
yes,
anything else until that's
That's
taken
right.
care of.
But sometimes you have to lift the physical, and you just have to, you know, regardless of what everybody says, you
It's a change in
sometimes
diet.
have to take some responsibility in this field yourself and bring them up to the point where they can suddenly get the head, literally the head above water, to the point where they're seeing for themselves.
They're still going to have to take responsibility for themselves if they're doing dietary things,
Yes.
because they're the ones that have to watch what they're
But
eating.
you're saying,
Okay.
do this, do that, it's then up to them to do it.
It's
Okay.
like vitamins and food is like bath baths.
Yes.
In a sense, like we're looking at the moon, which is the archetypal symbol of nourishment. And okay, symbolically, if you're getting better food into them, then in some way they're nourishing themselves better. Okay, so you're starting a process. I think it's inadequate unless you consider other things eventually. I was particularly was wondering about relationships for her. At the time of doing it, she had Saturn in the 6th approaching that 7th cusp, and there are a lot of things that suggested that she needed depth in relationships and possibly wasn't getting them. So, okay, so anyways, there were definitely menstrual problems, which, you know, even more strongly than the dietary ones were coming through, with irritability, premenstrual tension, etc. She did actually have hay fever problems, which are sinus, which is a Cancer moon rule type thing. Again, mucus coming out, and again a kind of an allergy. She had been tested for an allergy when she was a child, and she was actually allergic to dust, which does show quite an extreme kind of an allergy. Right, Earth.
It's a set.
And there's a square there from Saturn, as you can see. Okay, so there were quite strong correlations starting to come in at that point. I also wondered, okay, that the quincunx from the sun from the moon is working back towards the sun, and Sag, like on a physical level, rules the thigh, sciatic area. But it also has quite a lot to do with its reflex of Gemini, of the lungs and breathing in and breathing out. The Sag rules breathing out. And there's something also that the sun rules vitamin A, among other things, and vitamin A is very important in terms of keeping mucous membranes healthy. And we're basically looking at mucous membranes when we've got the moon down there, in a quincunx to the sun, ruler of vitamin A. And I thought that respiratory problems would probably be there, especially in terms of breathing out. And asthma, the difficulty is actually not in terms of getting breath in, but in actually getting enough breath out so you can get more air in again. And she'd had quite bad asthma from a child, from when she was a child. In fact, that was not from a child. Jane, we'll call her Jane, has suffered from constant asthma for the last 7 years. Yes.
Can I point something out here?
Sure.
There's a mistake in classic astrology. The usual idea with the lungs is it's all Gemini. It's not the case. It's the bronchi, it's the branchings of the lungs going down, but they're going down then to the alveoli, which is actually a Cancerian region or a fourth house region. Is that Pluto again?
Or the moon again, too, again, if it's a Cancer thing.
But I say that specifically with Pluto for the conditioned influences on the person.
Well, the thing with asthma is also you get spasm in the alveoli, and again you've got Uranus, which rules spasm. So again, there's that constriction happening at that level. Okay. Now, in terms of thigh problems, she wasn't aware of any, but there was quite a strong lesion in her iris, suggesting that in fact was a weak area for her. And there's a possibility of sciatica or something of that nature with Uranus involved in quincunxes to Sagittarius. In this way, in this case, I think it was working out far more in terms of respiratory type of things. That's the other thing that it came to with the medical astrology, was often many possibilities are thrown up, and it will manifest in one of those, in several of those ways, maybe not all of them. But I was surprised at how high the correlation was there. Okay, she had the respiratory problems, but she also had iris suggestion of difficulties inherent in her thigh region.
One of the things that can happen there, of course, is that the person is concerned with the problem which is most obvious to them or causes them the greatest amount of pain or difficulty, so that, for example, the hip is insignificant and the brain will actually accommodate itself over a fairly short period of time, so that pain is no longer recorded. It becomes a constant, like temperature, to which the whole body will adjust, so that the breathing function is the one which is causing all the stress. So she is unaware of the hip. All right. But as a breathing problem is alleviated, the hip problem will manifest, because you actually have to work backwards through them in a large number of cases.
Good point. There's a thing often in natural therapeutics where you expect a cure will actually work from, hopefully, if there are problems in inner organs that are very important, that the cure will actually move downward and outward. That once you cure something on an internal level, then it will manifest, any problems that are inherent there will manifest on at a less important level, and it will normally be lower down in the body or closer to the surface in some way, less important organs. So, which
Robert
Robert
was that is that when you put somebody on a bowel cleanse, when they particularly need it, put them on a heavy cleansing diet, their first complaint will be the spots they get. All right.
Okay. Another thing that then I think I haven't got them quite in the order that I did them, but anyway, the Neptune is square to Mars, and to me that seemed to link a little bit in with respiratory problems. Mars rules the adrenals, so there was a possibility there of lowered energy in some way. Neptune tends to diffuse things, if you like, and Mars is the energy that's available to this person. And with the square, in a sense, diffused, or the potential is there for it to be diffused, or to be fluctuating in some way.
To control over it is a 10,000 type square to Mars. To control this, of course.
Right. And of course, it's a Capricorn Mars which wants control a lot, and yet the Neptune, in a sense, is dissolving controls or unnecessary controls.
Try and make it universal, without
right.
using it over a vast area.
Sure, you have to define in some way, don't you?
This actually reinforces the other areas of expectation and disappointment, which regards to reinforcing the Sun square to Jupiter, the Mars square to Neptune, is in their expectation of what the consequences of the actions should be, and they never the reality never accords with that.
Absolutely right.
Notice also this, that in this square, square here reinforces something else here. We've got the Sun-Venus conjunction, so you'd start thinking possibly kidneys. Start thinking about the kidneys and the possibility of infection or inflammations, things like that. And then suddenly we see this Mars square Neptune in Libra, all right? And not only is Neptune going to be, not only are we talking here in terms of energy, but in terms of sitting on top of the kidneys are the adrenal glands, all right? And there we have the energy function within the human body. All right? And we've actually got it in squares. So here is a person who has difficulty getting moving, difficulty getting up in the morning, difficulty in getting that energy going. Right?
Right.
And Venus also rules the ascendants. Could you comment on that? Because
In terms of,
well, you pick the Libran connection.
I'm picking the Libran connection because it is. I had already viewed Venus in this case with regard to the ascendant and the eighth house Sun conjunction as possibly an over-metabolism of food in my case. An over-metabolism of food. That we've got it in Sagittarius. There's too much to start with. But with the Sun conjunct Venus, we burn it all up too. We use it.
Yes.
And then the eighth house, which depends very much on the depth, intensity of feeling, and whether that can be expressed, in which case it would burn up, and whether it can't, in which case it would be cut off.
Yes.
Right. Well, it's interesting that in terms of the major breakdown in her health, which would be related to asthma and also her weight problems, came on nearly about the same time. About 7 years ago, and it was about that time that she started to realise how dissatisfied she was in relationships, and right, but and in a sense that so she's resorted to the food as a way of coping on a psychological level. The Mars Neptune also has other repercussions. What else do you think of with Mars?
Mars Neptune indicates a very great susceptibility to poisoning with toxins and infections. Now Mars is in Capricorn, which rules the gallbladder, which actually detoxifies the bowel to a great extent. It's sort of an antiseptic. Now, if a person eats a lot of protein, they tend to accumulate a tremendous amount of toxins in the bowel, and she would be a great one for toxins being absorbed into the body and causing a lot of problems, maybe with her asthma even, because you get protein reactions from through asthma is caused by many protein reactions, and that's especially with Neptune in the sixth house. And if you've also got an excess of protein, then Libra, the kidneys, often has trouble excreting it.
Right. Good points. Anything else? What else does Mars rule? Come on, beginners. What about some of the beginners?
What you would do would actually be to take an ever-increasing control over pain.
You would try to? Did you say?
I would assume that she would take an ever-increasing control over pain and bury it. Admit to it less and less, which would mean she'd be admitting to emotional problems overall, less and less as she goes along. The fourth house Pluto as a starter. The eighth house is the area where it is actually operating as the repressive mechanism. And if you turn the chart around there, you find Saturn's in its 10th, there's a good deal of control there on the pain threshold. The ruler of the 8th is in the 10th. You've got the sun on the cusp of it squaring that, 10th house type square to it. There's an ever-increasing control over the pain threshold. Burying pain more and more.
Good point.
Well, I know very little about any of this, but Sagittarius on the 8th house, Sagittarius kind of expresses stuff rather than represses, doesn't it?
It can also amplify whatever that house's function is. And if the house's function is to control pain, then it can amplify the control over pain.
Yeah. There's also, like, the 8th house ruler is quincunx Saturn, you know, in the 5th. Again, that's another possible control thing coming in terms of the emotional area.
8th house type quincunx as well.
Yeah, right.
Saturn is
Okay.
control.
When Gary said look to some of the beginners as well, he's also saying think simply also.
Yeah.
Right? I mean that seriously, because this is.
Yeah, I'd hate all of you to, you know, like
Get
for the
lost,
beginners, to lose track of what's actually happening, because you can actually see it in really black and white. It's very, very simple. Just think of the three things, you know, three of the major things that Mars rules. You know, red blood cells is one. It rules the adrenals. It also rules muscles and energy. So red blood cells with Neptune, that tends to diffuse, and there's certainly a potential there for anemia. Is one possibility anyway, because Mars also rules iron. Okay, and we're already wondering if there may be difficulties in terms of absorbing things. And here we've got a Mars-Neptune square, which may suggest a difficulty in terms of absorbing iron or B12, which it also rules. So
That would be very much more complicated with the B12 and with the protein.
yes, it would be. Right.
What's her job?
She's actually a mother at the moment. That's her role at the moment.
Thinking about the involvement of children.
Right. And yeah, a really important area to her. Saturn's in the 5th.
And does she know that it's her task to learn from her child? That's the simple road.
Right. Yes, she does. Yeah, we talked about that. And
Saturn in the 5th with all.
you know, she'd always had this 5th house dampened with Saturn there. You know, she'd wanted to be very dramatic and very much the centre of stage when she was a child. She'd wanted to be on the stage, but her father, and Saturn often has links with the father figure, had stopped her. Had said, "No, you can't do that. You can't have that much fun." Okay. Okay, so she had all of these things to do with, like, Mars is in Capricorn, and as Nori said, Capricorn is the gallbladder. She said, "Oh no, I don't really have any problems with gallbladder." I thought she may have problems in digesting fat, because part of the gallbladder's role is to store bile, which it excretes into the system to help digest fats. She wasn't aware terribly much of fat digestion problems, but what she'd had was extreme pain actually going through her shoulder blades and extending up to one of the shoulders, and she'd been wondering whether she should go for a checkup. I suggested that she should, because it's really much better to be safe in those sort of situations. You know, she thought it might be a heart thing, but that's a classic symptom of gallbladder problems also. Okay, and some suggestion that there might be blocks there. I haven't also, let's see, I think there was another aspect to Mars which I haven't drawn in. It's opposite Uranus. Sorry, that's very important. Vital, okay. Mars-Uranus, and Uranus has the correlation of spasm, contractions. And, you know, the Uranus-Mars suggesting perhaps spasms in terms of the gallbladder. Okay, and yes, she did have anemia. She'd been treated for anemia, and the doctor had given her iron tablets, which hadn't improved the situation terribly much. She had felt stronger, but I think it's possibly B12, or she's got to look at dietary ways of getting the minerals that she needs. Jupiter-Saturn quincunx in a chart is often a symptom that the person doesn't absorb artificial nutrients terribly well.
Yeah.
And in that case, that was working.
Because of what Laura was saying also about the Mars and about not being able to deal with the toxins. Surely prescribing someone iron tablets, they wouldn't be able to cope with iron.
Look at Mars
Right.
and Capricorn.
The
Right.
problem wouldn't be on lack of iron, it's on the problem of the bonding of the oxygen to the hemoglobin.
Uh-huh.
That's 10th house square Neptune.
There's also the fact that
The 10th house is part of the bonding process. And there, it wouldn't bond very well. And I was looking at that to try and see other bonding type problems. 7th and 10th are the large ones there, Libra, Capricorn type of patterning. Libra usually for immediate molecular bonds, and also things like permeability of membranes, the ability of a membrane to shunt things through back and forth. That Scorpio there, again, shows a tendency to block off, shut out, prevent the connection from going on between the two things that may need to be exchanged or bonded.
Okay, oh, that's good.
Uranus, I have often found, deals with synthetics, because we're talking about modern technology, and Uranus is so often shown as the synthetic, and where you get this, where Uranus figures so strongly in there, synthetics of any description are going to cause problems to this person, and remembering that most of the drugs and so on which are put out are very much synthetic because they don't have the natural compounds around them, and with that Mars sitting there.
And they're rejected because of that.
Exactly. It's interesting actually, because I would guess that because Mars is in Capricorn, that artificial iron in this person would not cause diarrhea, but would cause constipation. All right, because we've got this restricting effect from Capricorn. We can just about nominate which way they're going to go. All right.
Between extremes anyway.
Did you find that she was lacking B12 that she couldn't absorb?
Unfortunately, I didn't test her for it. I suggested that was a potential problem. She was vegetarian. I suggested that she has spirulina, which she wasn't having, because that's an excellent source of B12. Like a vegetarian diet is incredibly healthy, but if you're getting indications in a chart that suggest possible problems in terms of nutrient absorption, especially related to iron and B12, well, not so much iron, sorry, but B12, which is Mars, then it's probably wise to make sure that they're very conscientious about getting that B12 through a natural product if possible. And spirulina is a really good source of it. Okay.
A brave face put on the world, though, isn't it?
Oh yes, sure. Very, very. Nothing's wrong. Yes, I like to have a good time. I like to laugh. There's nothing terribly wrong with me.
Yeah.
And then only after we were talking for a while, yes, I do lack self-confidence. Yes, there is this going wrong. Yes, there is that going wrong.
This is getting back to the Sagittarian ideal that one must not. Sagittarius is that clown, the true clown that's epitomised of the painted-on smile in times of extreme adversity, because they don't want to cause unhappiness to those people out there. Therefore, to do that, they have to keep on the smile no matter what they're going through. All right.
Also Jupiter in the 10th, the image.
Oh yes. I mean, you've got the Jupiter in the 10th. You've got that.
The ascendant ruler is
everything.
Sagittarius,
Yes.
isn't it? Venus, the ascendant ruler, is in Sagittarius.
Here's the
Have
person.
any problems like tension in the chest? Or
She didn't actually mention it, but I mean there is the asthma, of course, which is related to that.
sort of describe it? No, I was just thinking because I have an unconscious B12, that which I have some injections, and when I'm short of it, I feel as if I might have angina. I can't, if I walk up a hill, I get pains in my chest and difficulty breathing, and everything seems to be going in like this.
Right. Well, that may link in with, like again, some of the
So
symptoms that she was having.
The asthma, of course, she'd be aware of that difficulty breathing, but there's always opposition there. And Mars sometimes can be inflammation and fevers.
Good point. Yeah. Good point. Sorry.
What can you tell me about the Saturn Jupiter opposition the Jupiter squaring the Sun?
So it's a Saturn Jupiter quincunx.
Oh, it's quincunx.
Yeah, sorry, it's one of those charts that it's hard to see. And Jupiter square the Sun. Yeah. Well, obviously, Jupiter square the Sun, the person has to be careful of excess, of overdoing things again.
Specifically their emotional excess.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Look also to blood.
Blood problems? Sure.
It says all the Sagittarius is blood, and of course we've got Jupiter in Aquarius. Alright, so the blood in.
I mean,
try and make it universal without
right.
using it over a vast area.
Sure, you have to define in some way, don't you?
This actually reinforces the other areas of expectation and disappointment, which regards to reinforcing the Sun square to Jupiter, the Mars square to Neptune is in their expectation of what the consequences of the actions should be, and they never the reality never accords with that.
Absolutely right.
Notice also this, that in this square, square here reinforces something else here. We've got the Sun-Venus conjunction, so you'd start thinking possibly kidneys. Start thinking about the kidney. The kidneys and the possibility of infection or inflammations, things like that. And then suddenly we see this Mars square Neptune in Libra, all right? And not only is Neptune going to be, not only are we talking here in terms of energy, but in terms of sitting on top of the kidneys are the adrenal glands, all right? And there we have the energy function within the human body. All right? And we've actually got it in squares. So here is a person who has difficulty getting moving, difficulty getting up in the morning, difficulty in getting that energy going. Right?
Right.
And Venus also rules the...
You get circulation problems happening, arteriosclerosis. Her diet was reasonably good in terms of fat, so there didn't seem to be anything.
She actually does have quite a classic chart for a possible heart attack with no build-up to it, with Taurus rising, which accumulates debris and accumulates toxins. You've got the bowel toxins, you've got Pluto Leo, you've got the obviously dietary problems, and Jupiter and Aquarius with the reflex action.
Right.
May I ask a question there, incidentally? Because now let's turn. I'd like to turn something around there. With that Mars-Neptune square and the Neptune sitting in the 6th house in Libra, this person, of course, is obviously aimed towards helping others now. All right. Now, has there been any sign of that person's health or their activity starting to increase? All right. In other words, starting to put the challenge on that Mars because the person is now starting to help others.
I can't answer that specifically, unfortunately, but one of the suggestions I had was that she joined Youthline or Lifeline, of something of that nature, because of the strong 8th house, and a strong need to come to terms with feelings and communicate and to help others. And she'd actually, 6 weeks before the interview, she'd actually applied for Lifeline, which was really encouraging, I thought. And she'd felt, because she'd started to direct her energies a little bit more outwardly, like in terms of like the naturopathic thing, that her life was starting to look up. She realised that she had to make some decisions, especially about the major relationships she was in, but she was starting to feel like she could do it after 7 years of postponing it, putting it off. Okay. Now, of course, the Neptune is in Libra, and as Robert said, potential kidney problems, especially as Saturn is also in Libra, and Saturn does tend to have that thing of hardening or of restriction or limitation in some way. It's square the moon, and as I think you were saying, Nori, about you can get blocked kidneys, or kidneys that aren't purifying as the blood as well as they could, and you can get problems relating back from that.
Saturn in Libra, of course, is the potential for calcium build-up in the kidneys, i.e. kidney stones.
Right.
The potential for not manifestation.
Gary,
Yes.
it does seem to me that that from this there are specific dietary needs, minerals, vitamins, and the helpful. We've pulled everything to pieces in, whatever.
We haven't finished it, but
the kind of advice which, if you had absolute responsibility for the advice for this person of the succession of things which are needed, quite apart from the actions, which I have my own views on, but from the medical, when I say medical, the dietary, mineral, vitamin needs and others, to correct these imbalances. What would you advise?
Well, hopefully I've actually been suggesting them as I've been going along, but I would definitely.
There's a lot more is actually specifically mentioned in the first lecture. We were relating our first and second lectures where we were relating them to the various foods and so on.
But perhaps I'll come back to that at the end, David, because it's a really important point, isn't it? What you do with it, and I think I need to stress that if you don't feel capable, especially if the person's manifesting things that could be heart or anything that you're not sure of, then please send them to a doctor. I think that's terribly important. Okay, don't take on more responsibility than you're actually capable of handling. That's something that I keep in mind for myself always. That I see my role as more preventative rather than, to help in acute kind of life-death situations, as in a heart attack. Then a doctor is going to be pretty handy. I mean, there are some homeopathic things that one can do, but I'd still like the doctor to be there. Okay.
Cultivate a good relationship. If you start doing this, you must have a good relationship with a doctor, at least one. We are fortunate that we've got 3 around us, and although one of them doesn't believe in herbs and so on, he calls them fertilizer. We have 2 others who are willing to arrange diagnoses for us without interfering in our processes.
Just looking at that Mars in Capricorn and thinking of that sort of representing professional people like doctors, wouldn't she have problems?
You mean relating to authority figures?
Well, with the type of person she would go to, it might be the sort of doctor that would say, right, we'll have an operation. Or, as you say, give her iron tablets which she can't absorb.
Well, fortunately in this situation she is, she's a naturopathic student, so in this particular case she's reasonably conscious about dietary type things. But I did make, quite a few suggested avenues for her to start looking into, and I saw in this case, as well, I always seem to, but psychological being just as important as the physical, but definitely in this case some positive physical things needing to be started. Okay, so kidney problems in her iris. There were quite a few lesions in the iris area. She drank a lot of tea, which isn't terribly good for the kidneys. what else was happening? Oh, she was considerably overweight, and I tend to think that the overweight problem was probably fluid retention more than anything. The strong aspects to the moon, which has something to do with bodily fluids. The strong Neptune and Saturn in Libra, and especially Saturn squaring that moon, as well as Venus quincunx the ascendant, and Venus's bodily balances. There were lots of things.
Is the active functioning area of the kidneys, and there you've got Scorpio, and turn it around, put it on the 10th, total control.
Right. That's the other thing. Sorry. Like Pluto is incredibly important in the chart. Always when you get Pluto near one of the angles, then you must start to think there's a possibility that there's a dysfunction here that's quite is below the surface and but is actually very, very important. And it may be in terms of one of the endocrine glands, because Pluto does have some link up with those.
Minus the 4th house involved.
Elimination is what it's all about.
Pluto is elimination, so one would need to be careful in that case.
Yeah, also the opposite, retention elimination, storage and discharge. Both.
Right, and she certainly had a problem, I think, in terms of fluid retention. You know, the weight was quite, as I was saying, quite
Did
considerable.
that happen after she had her children, or was she always...
Yes, it did. It did happen after she'd had her last child. I'm sorry, I didn't mention that. I actually thought, I put it in, that there might be difficulties in terms of childbirth with the moon square Saturn and the moon conjunct Uranus and sun-moon quincunx. I thought, you know, there's a potential there for it to be tricky. She, in fact, had reasonably easy childbirths.
What about conception?
She didn't mention any miscarriages, but Jupiter is trying that moon, which I think must have been helped considerably in this situation. She did have very, very long labours.
Was a natural birth, wasn't a caesarean?
It was a natural birth. She didn't actually have a caesarean, but yeah, it was in a hospital. It wasn't at home. Okay, and I think in that case it was coming out more through menstruation and that extremely unusual cycle that woman had. Okay, I mentioned Mars, the adrenals. She did have hyperglycemic symptoms to some degree, which are linked in with adrenals. In other words, she would have very low spots during the day, where she would need to eat to actually get her energy back up again pretty quickly. And the tea that she was drinking, she'd have a cup of tea with sugar or whatever every time she felt low, and that would sort of bring her up.
One connection there, Gary, is Aries' 12th house. The 12th house is the hypothalamus, which samples the blood sugars right the way through the day,
Right.
And turns on the apostat if they're low, which is also a Neptune function.
Right, and you've got the Mars square Neptune in effect. Right,
Precisely.
right, good. Okay, so
Does this chart indicate then what you're saying, that she could be like to get the lagging sugar?
diabetes. There doesn't seem to be a very strong Virgo type thing happening, which rules the pancreas. Okay, there are, Sun-Venus conjunction, especially square that moon. Sun-Venus rules sugar. She may tend towards bolting the sugar down when she's not feeling happy or not feeling nourished. And the Neptune Mars suggesting perhaps some fluctuation linked with the adrenals. The tea I suggested that she cuts out, because in fact all that does is it thrashes the adrenals, actually stimulates them. It's like coffee, and so she wasn't actually helping the situation. More pantothenic acid, which is one of the B vitamins, that's very good for helping to build up the adrenals, and is actually ruled by Neptune, and in this case squaring Mars. Not enough perhaps pantothenic acid. I mean, there are many other things that one can do with low blood sugar. The major thing being making sure that she eats a little often, having lots of small meals during the day.
Tea can also be a problem, a grave problem in terms of the diuretic procedure, the removal of water from the body, because it seems to almost have a tanning, remember it's tannin, a tanning effect on the kidneys.
Okay. What other things seem to come up? I suggested that there may be possibility of headaches, and that was a reasonably long one. It was just like, I mean, there's Aries on the 12th, which is a fairly sensitive spot. Mars, the cardinal cross is activated. You know, we've got a lot of difficult aspects in cardinal areas: Cancer, Libra, Capricorn. The opposite point is Aries, which is the head region, and sometimes you'll get problems coming out in the opposite area of the cross. In this particular case, I don't think she had any. She didn't really suffer from headaches. Yeah, sorry. I wondered about that, but in fact, she seemed to say that she didn't have any problem there.
Mars and Capricorn may have been able to control themselves anyway.
Sure. Okay. I wondered also about a hydrochloric acid supplement possibly needed in terms of digestion, and again that was linked to the stomach secretions. You know, if there's not enough hydrochloric acid in the body, then you're not going to be digesting terribly well. Okay, there's the pancreas seemed fine in the iris, so again that suggested no problems with diabetes. There was the beginning of what's called a scirphrim in the iris, which was a scirphrim is linked with problems with circulation to extremities, which we were looking at with the Jupiter being in Aquarius, which rules circulation, especially to extremities. So that seemed to be showing as it was building up. I wondered if there may be difficulties, especially with Pluto square a Taurus ascendant, whether there might be difficulties with the thyroid. And I tend to link parathyroidism with Saturn, because parathyroid actually it does have that function.
I would have also questioned another thing too here, and that is the salt intake. That moon Uranus, because Uranus is very much linked in with the salt intake of the person. I have found, and there is an interesting thing to that. You have to remember that the general diet in New Zealand, outside of salt, is very low in iodine, and there are some people who you suddenly find out that they are using salt purely to get the magnesium iodide out of it, because table salt is specifically in New Zealand supplemented with the iodine, because water does not flow far enough anywhere in this country to actually be able to pick up the traces that we need. This, of course, is why there were so many thyroid goiter problems in New Zealand in the last century and early part of this century. And of course, the salt is also connected with the water retention and the sodium-calcium balance with this Uranus-Saturn within the chart.
So where do you get your iodine from if you cut out?
Well, obviously you ship them onto kelp.
But arsenic.
Yes, I mean that all came about so
It's all right again now.
Yeah, I mean, there are classic cases of arsenic poisoning. When you know, the tolerance for arsenic rises anyway.
So it's all right. Despite what it says.
You know, my attitude to this is you have to be, fairly reasonable. I mean, if we really got down to it, we wouldn't eat anything, we wouldn't drink anything, and we wouldn't breathe anything.
I said that, I withdraw.
All right? We literally wouldn't. You know, there are people involved in this field, in the nutritional field, who I once described somebody as lesser than an ant, which upset them rather, because they have, the ant is concerned with the nutrition and scurrying backwards and forwards, but they still have a social structure. And there are some people who get so involved in the nutritional, the natural nutritional aspects, that they actually forget everything else. They are living, breathing, thinking, talking, sleeping with food. And that is unhealthy.
It's out of balance.
It's totally out of balance. And therefore, we look at balance. And sometimes, there isn't one person who is not a humanistic sort of nutritional counsellor of some sort. I mean, I'm talking about it all the time. I haven't got rid of this yet.
Got the new title for your next book, The Sex Life of the Food Palace.
Sell 1 million copies.
But you will find that, Gary, most people who are involved, who have actually gone in, involved in astrology or some other humanistic science, actually recognises that we have to maintain some balance. We look at things and say, we know that we cannot be purity. You know, we're humans. Right? And it's very
Read
important.
a peck of dust before you die.
Yes.
I can always remember going along the first year of the naturopathic college, and during our breaks, we used to have weekends that you go along for the whole weekend. And at that point in time, I had a particular addiction to fish and chips. So I wandered down to the takeaway shop. I came back with my fish and chips, and the look of horror had to be seen to be believed. So I might, yes, right. So.
Do you still like your fish and chips?
I actually don't eat them so much now. I like, I'll have sometimes
Still
have
have
fish.
them occasionally?
I still have them occasionally. Yeah, I wouldn't stop myself if in a certain situation. I think the major thing to do is make sure that your diet is good 80 or 90% of the time, you know, and so what if you have a piece of meat once in a while, if you're out at somebody's place, or something else that you consider bad?
What's wrong with fish and chips?
Yes, that's what I like.
Sure, I actually, yeah, sure. If they're cooked in fresh oil, and the fish is fresh and all the rest of it, but you know, some takeaway shops you go into and the oil has been there for days and there's big brown clouds coming off and you think, oh God, what's that going to do? Sort of like nuclear fallout or something, you know. You know, I mean, it's up to you to choose for yourself. You know, in terms of what's right for you. I don't think you can necessarily always say one particular diet isn't going to be right for everybody, and it's neurotic to suggest. Sorry, Dennis.
There is another aspect. Sorry.
If I can refer back to the chart for a moment, it seems to me that the diagnosis boils down to one single thing: an overactive, blocked fear, fight, flight mechanism.
Yep.
Yeah, that's good, Dennis.
Yep.
Thanks.
Yeah. You hear that, Dennis?
Yeah. Fear, fight, flight mechanism. Actually, all of the positive signs are involved in that.
Your fear
These are more of a complete fused thing than we really recognise very much yet. If a person is afraid, they feel that there's a situation there that they've got to deal with and get away from, then certain things happen in very short order. First of all, the sympathetic nervous system switches on very abruptly, gives you a high charge of nervous energy, the uranium side, which then in itself can get you moving, but can't take you very far because you'll burn that out very fast. That in itself then triggers off various other stages. It narrows down the arteries, squeezing the blood from that reservoir up to the surface, to the muscles for immediate use of fuel, pumping the fuel, the oxygen, to the muscles. That's the Sagittarian stage, narrowing of the arteries. The adrenals are triggered, but they take a little while to come into effect. So it takes a while for the adrenaline to come around the bloodstream to get to the muscles, to start catabolizing the process of the burning of blood sugars. The heartbeat speeds up, and if the person is under stress for any length of time, then the thyroid also is activated to start producing thyroxine to add to the utilization of oxygen. This is going around from Aquarius, Sagittarius, Libra, Leo, Gemini. All of those come into play, one after the other, in a stream. And looking at her, the Sagittarian side is actually running away from problems.
Right.
Often the travel of the Sagittarian is, I don't want to be here, I want to be elsewhere.
Yes.
Right.
The fourth house there is a territorial threat. The territorial security is not secure at all, it's a total threat. And she wants to get away out of threatening territory.
Sure.
But the Taurian ascendant doesn't move.
It's taken 7 years, which is one of the cycles is
There is it
saying.
in the 8,000 squashes, which means that all of those things within the body are going on and trying to get moving, and she won't move.
Right, thanks. Okay. Right, well they were the major things that... I also thought possibly skin problems, because Saturn was involved, and sometimes you do get skin problems.
And look at the Mars coming out through Capricorn too.
Right. Mars and Capricorn have problems to it.
Run,
Yes.
Right. She didn't actually have any skin problems, okay? She had boils quite badly as a child, major cases of boils, school sores, that sort of thing, but hadn't had anything since. So, like in terms of the things that correlated purely on a physical level, I also did a psychological and went through that with her. It was extremely high. She wasn't manifesting skin problems at the moment, but virtually everything else that is suggested and could be seen by somebody that's, not too experienced with astrology, they're reasonably obvious things, would have been able to say what were the major areas of potential weakness for her. Okay?
This is an exceptionally good chart actually in those terms.
Right. Yeah. Now the thing is that, again, if I hadn't had iridology, in some of these cases, then it's a good backup. Like when I see kidney problems, I see that she's overweight, and it's possibly fluid retention. But if you can look in the iris, then and you see lesions in the kidney area, then that's like saying, well, yes, okay, that's more of an indication. Okay, I thought that the problem may be thyroid with that Pluto square the Taurus ascendant, but the thyroid looked okay in the iris. So they're just different starting points in terms of what you then do for the patient.
Incidentally, if I may sidetrack, anybody who becomes interested in iridology, there is actually an organisation called Nature Sunshine Industries in Auckland, which regularly brings in, this once, twice a year, brings in, he's often a doctor, a guy called Eugene Watkins, who is was a medical doctor, and he runs a 3 or 4 day intensive weekend on iridology, and he is exceptionally good. He has been involved with Bernard Jensen, who is the most respected and renowned iridologist and worker in this field in the world. And although it may cost a couple of $100 to go on his course, it is well worthwhile as a supplement in astrology. Well, I would recommend it to anybody. Although you will have to keep a little quiet about your interest in other matters, because there are usually a large number of Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons involved at the same time in these courses. And if they find out what you are, you suddenly find yourself isolated, as happened to me. I didn't say something, somebody said something to me, and I found myself in a group of 4. In a room full of about 60 or 70 people. And the rest were split up into their 2 factions, and there was 4 of us sitting around, all by ourselves. But I would strongly recommend it. Strongly recommend it. Pardon?
How do you contact them?
Actually, if you leave your names and addresses and say you want to be on our mailing list, all right, we have a mailing list. Leave your names and addresses over there and just put mailing list on it. We'll put you on our mailing list, and I'll make a special point of advertising for them next time this one's coming up. It mightn't come up for 6 or 7 months, but we'll let you know when this one's coming.
That's great. I'd add a rider on the iridology. It's just like chart analysis. It can be very dangerous if you say, oh, let me have a look at your eye. Oh, goodness. And the person just feels awful. And you can do that with a chart as well. So, I really think in terms of, for me to get anything really useful, iridology is meant to be a holistic type of thing. I like to sit with a person looking into their irises for at least 20 minutes, half an hour, to get a really good picture of how the body's working, and an hour would be better. I mean, obviously, if I need to check something just very quickly, I can do that if I've got the chart there and think, right, well, I'll look at the adrenals or whatever. But use with caution.
As to whether the iris actually is patterned like the birth chart in any way?
It's not.
No.
It doesn't. It's
No.
not as far as
You've got to straighten out the birth chart.
Yeah.
Take it down from. You've got to have a linear chart. Here it doesn't hide there.
Yes.
What would you have given the constitution?
In terms of homeopathic remedies, I haven't actually given that any thought, and it's something like, again, homeopathic remedies are something that need a lot of time and consideration. I'll just read like the concluding remarks that I had in this particular case study. It is, on page 44, it is suggested that when Lee's life is out of balance due to relationships, she may manifest one of the list of ailments. This is in fact quite true of quite a few of the diseases listed, included adrenals, lower back pains when lifting, which she had, I didn't mention that, kidneys, problems with fluid balances in the body, obesity, liver, and the potential for weaknesses in the thighs. Okay, these were all tied up to Libra on the 6th, the ruler being in Sagittarius, also ruler of the ascendant, and the quincunxes, etc., that were happening to it. This tie-up suggested to me that Lee needs to look at the relationships in her life more closely. I feel being able to share problems, her own, as well as listening to others, within the context of her daily routine would be very beneficial for her. She needs someone to bounce things off, as well as a more balanced approach to life in general, but especially in her important one-to-one relationships. She needs to expand in the psychological areas, which is all the Sagittarius 8 and everything else, the Pluto. I suggested these things to her as a possible cause of her weight problems and other health areas. She agreed with this. She's been slowly been coming to this realization herself. This process is being speeded up by her involvement in the college, and as her growth has been greatly accelerated, but perhaps not matched in some of her major relationships. So, that was the end of that particular case. Okay, can I hand over to you, Robert? Unless there's any
questions on medical stuff, because I want to do a little summary at the end of concerning medical astrology.
Okay.
Right. Good question.
If for some reason an organ or a function sits in limbo, does the astrology pick that up? Rather than malfunctions, we're talking about malfunction of organs. What if something just sits in limbo? Does that show in iridology?
It's like iridology will show a gradual weakening of that particular area. In other words, there are stages in a process. It's not as if, this organ is malfunctioning. No, it's not malfunctioning. You'll find there are degrees of colouring which will suggest the state of that particular organ on a relative scale.
Well, could it miss? Okay, put it around the way that I've intended. Could it miss if an organ were just for some reason the nervous connections and everything were not working for a period of time, so that you can get regeneration later?
It
can
should
it miss that limbo phase, which is not actually producing wrong product at the wrong time, but
through its inaction, the body is going to be out of balance or in a state of dis-ease anyway, isn't it?
Oh, it will be, but won't necessarily show that organ.
It should show.
An organ that you say is limbo.
Exactly.
Well, I'm not saying it's not, I'm saying can iridology pick it up?
One of the things
At that stage, if there were a question, you'd do some kind of cross-checking.
Exactly.
Yeah,
it's always
absolutely.
shown more than once. Something that's shown once, always be suspicious of. All right? Okay. The other thing about iridology, one of the reasons that it's not by the standard medical profession is that they say, how can you possibly expect to treat somebody through the eyes? All right? Now, it's like saying, how can you treat somebody with the chart? The piece of paper or the blackboard is not what you're going to hit them over the head with. All right? That's not going to do anything. What we're talking about is the human being. The iris is used as a diagnostic assist tool. All right? The same as the chart is a diagnostic assist. It won't tell you, for example, iridology may show a kidney malfunction, dysfunction. It won't tell you if you've got kidney stones or what specifically it is. It could be granuli within the kidney itself. You don't know, all right? You have to go further. You have to arrange for diagnosis of some description. Yep.
I'd like very much to thank Gary for what he's done, very greatly, to apologise to him for interrupting his train of thought all the time, and to thank him for allowing us to share our own thoughts with him.
I didn't feel interrupted. I was just a little bit overwhelmed when it suddenly all started coming in. It was really good because here everybody was actually immediately starting to tune in. And I hope that the major thing is in terms of you beginners or intermediate people, are you starting to see how it's shown, you know? Because you're probably familiar with the psychological things, or you're starting to get a grasp on it.
But it actually helps make it clear.
Yes, it gives it a solid ground.
What I was going to say, in particular, from my point of view, is that medical astrology, I hope, will make people aware of compassion. All right? The compassionate approach. It is very easy to look at this chart and take the cold-blooded approach and say, lazy. Isn't it? It would be very easy to look at that chart and say, essentially you're a lazy person, all right, if you're working strictly at one level. But the moment you see that the adrenals and so on are not functioning correctly, you're now working at a different level. You're not saying, now, why, you know, too often it's projected as, you are lazy, rather than, now, why does this person have a difficulty in generating their own energy or becoming active? All right? It's too often. Pardon?
You start seeing it as fear held in check.
Exactly. And, you know, one of the things that I hate about anything in this field, and I see it through our other connections, I see it in tarot, I see it in every form of reading which is done, where people will give these absolute statements, which are horrendous to my way of thinking, utterly horrendous. Because they do not allow the person to grow, they do not give them an option of any description whatsoever, and they do not even have that level of compassion which says, perhaps there is another reason, perhaps there's half a dozen reasons for this to be. If you're going to make a statement that you are lazy, because no person is knowledgeably lazy. Now, nobody sees themselves as lazy, therefore the astrologer or the person giving the reading is effectively wrong. They're effectively wrong. The person is not lazy.
They're saying a lot about themselves.
Pardon?
They're saying a lot about themselves.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a judgment.
I'd like to make a very positive statement about the need of this person.
Yes.
I think that they need, because of the Taurus ascendant and the need of learning their true selves through the Saturn, they need a very simple approach. And that's Saturn in the 5th. Although all their inclination is to repeat the mistakes of their childhood and the problems which were imposed upon them and the lack of love and affection, their need is to learn through their child, and by standing back, of not controlling their child, but observing the life of their child as externalized through the Sagittarius, because that's also, that Sun in the Sagittarius, also their child having an adventurous approach to life, and learning from them simply, that would lead them into the externalization of their own life.
I'd just like to make one comment. It's my theme song that you must have laughter for health, because it reorganizes the whole being. It does affect the body chemistry. Another of my theme songs is no human being flourishes without encouragement.
Absolutely. This person, yes, this person would respond fantastically to just being loved. TLC. They would respond fantastically. The whole thing is they are detaching from their own emotions and feelings. The moment you start showing them that they're lovable beings, you're going to go an enormous distance because they're worthwhile. All right? They're worthwhile. And then you can start encouraging them to do things, to actually manifest some of this energy, get some of it out, and particularly out to others. You know? So I hope that has also got through, that there's an awful lot connected in. I like medical astrology because it's a dimension which is left out and which is a part of the entire being. Yeah, it's a beautiful side to it, and because it's in its infancy to a large extent in the modern world, it's certainly exceedingly exciting. Every time you go out and do a chart, you are putting your life on the line, your neck on the line. But it's enjoyable. It's exhilarating.
Do you recommend a good book for beginners?
Yeah, the best single book is that American book of nutrition and medical astrology.
Yes, yeah, the American book of nutrition. Eileen Nauman. All right. Nauman, Nauman.
As well as covering astrological things very well, she actually has an encyclopedia in the back on all the vitamins and minerals.
Has somebody got one there?
And also on herbs.
No, I bought it.
They are expensive. So $32, and you can buy them. But it's far better than any of the other ones that are available in New Zealand at this point in time. I've looked at most of them, I've looked at all of them that are available, and this one's the best at the moment. Okay, thank you.